The purpose of sentencing. There are four purposes to sentencing. One, retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. Retribution is the person getting their just desserts. They committed a crime, so they got to do the time. A deterrence is to stop other people from doing the same crime once they see what a person has been convicted of and the sentence they got. Incapacitation refers to the fact that he or she is in custody, which means they can no longer commit a crime while in custody. And rehabilitation is to provide them with education, behaviors, patterns, so they can be better, outstanding citizens to the community. So the discussion questions are going to be answered online tonight at our Zoom meeting. Legislators make laws to help determine sentences. An intermediate sentence is example 5 to 7 years. It's a short end, minimum, and a maximum, and that gives the judge discrepancies to the discretion to consider mitigating factors. A determinate sentence is just that, 10 years in prison, which is determined by the legislation for that particular crime. Good time refers to a person's behavior while in custody, and it's important that people have an incentive to behave because there's a lot more prisoners than there are guards. Truth and sentencing laws refer to the citizens' victims group. Says, this guy got 10 years, he only served 2. That's not right. So they may pass laws to hold states accountable for, holding up to what their sentence is going to be. But it forced a lot of departments to reconsider because of the jail overcrowding. There's so many people in there with so much time, and then the feds are coming in saying, hey, the jails are too crowded, that's inhumane treatment. So the type of punishments are capital, imprisonment, probation, fines, and other community-related, go to anger management classes, or can be another form of sentencing. And again, we'll discuss the discussion questions in our Zoom meeting tonight. So the two main participants in the ritual are the judge and the defendant. And, other participants include the probation officer who provides information to the judge so he can sentence whether or not he's had multiple convictions, whether he has a job. And so that's a big part of the sentencing process. The judge is the main player, the defendant, the person being sentenced, and information. And then, of course, the jury will come in to decide most capital cases, and the judge provides instructions to the jury. So what factors go into determining what sentence a person is going to get? And obviously, the seriousness of the crime. The more serious, the more time. Conviction versus real offenses. Aggravating circumstances. Did he shoot, stab, kick, beat, and spit on the person? Or mitigating circumstances. Was he abused as a child and just lived in foster homes? What are his circumstances? And then the philosophy of the judge has a lot to do with sentencing. I told you the story about one judge who's a homeless advocate, and a guy had murdered a homeless guy and laughed at him and raped his girlfriend, so the judge cried and threw the book at him. So those things happening. Now, there's such a thing as sentencing disparity. Remember that philosophy of a judge? Well, they're different in different courtrooms. So if a person is convicted of similar crimes but didn't receive the similar sentences, something's wrong. They look for some uniformity amongst them. So that is called sentencing disparity. And sentences discrimination is when a gender, race, or economic standing influences the extralegal, the outcome based on those considerations. So 3 ways disparity occurs is when offenders receive similar sentences for different crimes of unequal seriousness. So again, that unfairness of the verdicts. Offenders receive different sentences for unequal crimes, and mitigating or aggravating circumstances have a disproportionate effect on sentences. You can remember the case in Stanford where the guy raped the unconscious student and basically got probation, Brock Turner. So that was a mitigating circumstances, but in his favor as opposed to hers. So the punishment penalty, that's the rate of imprisonment, rise significantly from those who are young, minorities, and unemployed. So they get that's another part of sentencing discrimination, excuse me. Then there's the chivalry effect, where women convicted of crimes are less likely to go to prisons than their male counterparts, and who are incarcerated tend to serve shorter sentences because they're female, because they represent our mothers and our sisters. And so here's that discretionary word. Well, the judges have a lot of that, and there's pros and cons to it. And it allows judges to impose a variety of sentences, which goes back to that sentencing disparity based on specific cases. So the critics of judicial discretion believe the costs outweigh the benefits and calls for sentencing guidelines. And that's where the legislature has predetermined sentences for certain crimes and basically turned into mandatory guidelines that takes away from the discretion of the judge, like 3 strikes or habitual offenders. And what that's done is made the jail overcrowding. It's made prison more violence, because if I know I'm going for my 3rd strike, I'm gonna fight like hell not to go back. And of course, that's been unpopular with judges. And so there are reform approaches to expanding judicial discretion, giving them the discretion back, limiting habitual offenders, and repealing or revising those 3-strike laws. Victim impact statement, and that's a statement to the sentencing body, which is a jury of the judge, which the victim is given the opportunity to describe how the crime affect her or him or their families. It's been controversial because it creates an emotional situation in the courtroom, and that's where some of those fights we saw break out. So the pros are the people who believe you should do it. It gives a survivor a voice, it's therapeutic benefit for the victim, and help judges and jury appreciate all the circumstances of the crime. And people who are against it say that it injects prejudicial evidence into the sentencing process and brings unacceptable level of emotion to the courtroom. So which ways, how do we carry out capital punishment? Well, lethal injection, lethal gas, hanging, firing squad, and lethal injection. So those are some of the methods that different folks have applied to the death penalty. And the death penalty in the Supreme Court, currently, there's been a lot of legal challenges, death row inmates, on the methods that are being used because they say it's inhumane. There's one, you see that on the discussion question. A lot of countries have done away with the death penalty, and we wonder why the United States still holds it high as a right and a privilege of the justice system. So there's this talks about the 2 stages, and that's where the jury determines the guilt. And then in the second phase, the jury reconvenes and considers aggravating and mitigating factors in the sentencing phase, and they can vote for the death penalty or life in prison. And this is just a schematic showing how that 2-phase bifurcated system works. And it goes to the jury, make the finding, and then back to the jury, and they vote yes, then it's execution time. Juries must be involved in both stages of the bifurcation process. Alabama is one of the only states that routinely allows a measure of judicial discretion when it comes to capital punishment, where the judge can overrule the jury. Mitigating circumstances will prevent a defendant found guilty of first-degree murder from receiving the death penalty, like insanity, mental retardation, or age, being youthful, too young for it. So some of the issues when debating the death penalty are whether or not it serves as a deterrent. Is it 100% or is it fallible? The arbitrariness of it in different states, and mostly minorities and people of color are being executed when others go free, and it's discriminatory effects. So those are some of the arguments, and here's a list of the states with the death penalty, and those without. Those in blue have the dark blue have the death penalty in that greenish color. States without. So there's a lot more with than without. So what's the immediate future of the death penalty? There's been a reason for the decline in executions. The United States Supreme Court removed the possibility that hundreds of mentally handicapped or juvenile offenders could be sentenced. So that's reduced the number of sentencing. And public opinion is changing rapidly in regards to the application of the death penalty. And that's it. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.